Sometimes, a man ventures into the untamed wilderness not seeking self-discovery, but craving oblivion. This was the precise intention etched into Jedediah Crane's soul as he arrived at a dilapidated cabin nestled high within the rugged Montana mountains. Accompanied only by his steadfast dog, he carried the crushing weight of a lifetime's worth of sorrow. He sought a sanctuary, a tranquil haven where he could quietly spend his remaining years far removed from the haunting echoes of his past. But one fateful evening, an extraordinary event shattered the tranquility. A young girl emerged from the dense treeline, moving with a pack of wolves as if they were her kin. She was no captive, no victim of circumstance. Since infancy, these wolves had raised her, and she lived wild and untamed in a world beyond most people's comprehension. What would transpire when their disparate worlds collided? Before we delve deeper, let us know where you're joining us from. And if this tale resonates with you, remember to subscribe. The arduous journey to the high country had consumed 4 days on horseback for Jedediah Crane, each passing mile taking him farther from his previous life, and deeper into a profound solitude he simultaneously yearned for and dreaded. At 63, his body was a living testament to a life of hardship. His knees ached with the onset of cold mornings. His hands were gnarled from decades spent working trap lines, and his back bore the enduring memory of every fall from every contrary mule he had ever encountered. His face was like weathered leather, etched with deep creases around eyes that had witnessed too much, and his mouth had forgotten how to smile somewhere along the winding road of life. The cabin stood nestled in a clearing at the edge of the timberline, where the towering lodgepole pines gradually gave way to the hardy whitebark, and the wind carried the invigorating scent of high altitude. It had once belonged to an old trapper named Silas Dutton, who had toiled in these mountains for 3 decades before succumbing to heart failure one harsh winter. Silas had no family, no heirs, only a handwritten will, bequeathing the place to any soul bold or foolish enough to desire it. Jed figured he fit both descriptions. The structure was far from impressive. Roughly hewn logs were chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney leaned precariously to the north, and a roof of hand-split shakes had weathered many decades. Yet it was sturdy enough, built by a man who understood that at nearly 9,000 feet, a poorly constructed shelter could mean certain death. The single room measured perhaps 15 feet square, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a rudimentary wooden bunk built into another, and a few shelves sagging under the accumulation of dust and mouse droppings. Jed's dog, a blue heeler named Rufus, had bounded into the cabin ahead of him, his nose working overtime as he meticulously investigated every nook and cranny. The dog was 11 years old, his muzzle dusted with gray, yet he retained the boundless energy of a pup when something piqued his interest. Rufus had been Jed's unwavering companion since his wife Sarah's passing, the one living creature who seemed to grasp that grief knows no timeline, that some mornings, simply getting out of bed was an act of sheer willpower. Sarah had been gone for 3 years now. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days if Jed was keeping count. And he always was. Cancer had stolen her slowly and cruelly, taking her piece by piece until the vibrant woman he loved was reduced to a mere shadow in a bed, her hand in his growing lighter with each passing day. Toward the end, she had made him promise not to waste away in their house in Kalispell, not to transform their home into a shrine to her memory. "Go live, Jed," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Find some peace up in those mountains you always loved. Don't let my dying be the last thing you do." He tried to honor that promise, he truly did, but the house was haunted by too many ghosts. Her coffee cup still in the cabinet, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her garden tools in the shed, patiently waiting for hands that would never hold them again. The town held too many pitying glances, too many well-meaning neighbors asking how he was doing when both knew there was no solace in any answer. So, when he had heard about Silas Dutton's place through a friend of a friend, Jed had sold everything that mattered and packed what remained onto 2 mules and his old sorrel mare, Copper. The first week at the cabin was consumed by labor. Jed patched the roof where animals had torn through, replaced the rotted floorboards near the door, cleared a bird's nest from the chimney, and scrubbed away years of accumulated grime from every surface. He repaired the corral fence for Copper and built a small lean-to for the mules. He chopped and stacked firewood until his back screamed in agony and his hands were covered in blisters, because up here, winter arrived early and lingered long, and running out of wood meant running out of life. Rufus adapted quickly, as dogs often do. He spent his days exploring the surrounding forest, chasing squirrels he would never catch, and returning at dusk with burrs in his coat and a satisfied gleam in his eyes. At night, he would curl up by the fire, his presence a silent comfort that required no conversation or explanation. Sometimes Jed would talk to him, rambling thoughts about Sarah, about the years they had shared, about the children they had never been able to have. Rufus would listen with his intelligent eyes, never judging, never offering false comfort. The mountains themselves were a presence Jed had forgotten the weight of. He had trapped these ranges in his younger days before Sarah, before settling down to run a hardware store in town. Back then, the wilderness had felt like freedom, endless, wild, indifferent to human troubles. Now, it felt different, heavier somehow. The silence up here wasn't peaceful. It was absolute. At night, when the fire burned low and the darkness pressed against the cabin walls, Jed could hear his own heartbeat, his own breathing, the creak of his joints when he shifted position. Sometimes he wondered if this was what dying would feel like. A gradual fading into that vast silence until nothing remained but the wind whispering through the pines. He established a routine because routine was what kept a man sane in solitude. Up at first light, coffee boiled strong and black in a dented pot, breakfast of fried salt pork and day-old biscuits. Then he would check his small trap line, a dozen sets within a few miles of the cabin, mostly for marten and fox. The pelts weren't worth much anymore, but the work gave his days structure. Afternoons were for chores, cutting wood, hauling water from the creek, maintaining his gear, tending to Copper and the mules. Evenings were the hardest. That's when the quiet became oppressive, when his thoughts would spiral back to Sarah, to the life he had lost, to the emptiness that awaited him now. He had seen evidence of wolves almost immediately, tracks in the mud near the creek, scat on the game trails, the distant howling at night that made Rufus' ears prick up and a low growl rumble in his chest. Jed wasn't worried. He had lived around wolves before and knew they generally avoided humans. But there was something about these wolves, something in the frequency and boldness of their presence that felt different, almost unnatural. One morning, checking a trap near a beaver pond, he had found it sprung and empty, the bait gone and tracks all around. Wolf tracks, but also something else, smaller prints, barefoot, human-sized, but not quite human in their distribution and gait. Jed had knelt there in the frost-stiffened grass, studying those tracks with growing unease. They led to the wolf prints and away from them, sometimes overlapping, sometimes parallel, as if whoever made them had been walking with the wolves, running with them. He mentioned it to no one because there was no one to mention it to. His nearest neighbor was 12 miles down the mountain, a sheep rancher named Horace Blackwell, whom Jed had met exactly once when he had ridden through Blackwell's property on his way up. Horace had been cordial but distant, the way mountain people often are with newcomers. He had warned Jed about the winters, about the wolves, about something he had called the wild thing that lived up in the high timber. Jed had nodded politely, assuming it was local superstition, the kind of tales that grew in isolated places where long winters made men see things that weren't there. But those tracks had been real, and over the following weeks, Jed had found more evidence. A cache of bones near his trapline, picked clean and arranged in a way that suggested intelligence, purpose. Scratches on trees at odd heights, and once, just once, the feeling of being watched so intensely that he had spun around with his rifle raised, only to see nothing but forest shadows and the judging eyes of a raven perched in a dead snag. Rufus had noticed, too. The dog had become increasingly alert, spending more time on the cabin's porch, head up and nose working the breeze. Sometimes he would whine low in his throat, a sound of confusion rather than fear. Once he had barked furiously at the treeline for a full minute before Jed could call him down. And even then, the dog had remained tense, hackles raised, staring at something Jed couldn't see. The cabin had one small window facing east, and Jed had taken to sitting there in the evenings, watching the light fade from the high peaks and the shadows pool in the valleys below. It was during one of these vigils, 3 weeks into his occupancy, that he saw them clearly for the first time. A pack of wolves emerged from the timber just after sunset, 7 of them, moving in that loose formation that wolves use when they're not hunting, just traveling. They were beautiful animals, big and rangy, their coats shading from silver gray to near black, moving with the confidence of creatures that owned this land long before humans had ever thought to claim it. And with them, moving as naturally as if she were part of the pack, was a girl. She was young, Jed guessed, maybe 16 or 17, though it was hard to tell at that distance. She wore what looked like buckskin or leather, crude garments that covered her modestly, but left her arms and legs mostly bare despite the evening chill. Her hair was long and dark, tangled with what might have been feathers or bones. She moved on all fours, sometimes loping alongside the wolves with an easy grace, then rising to walk upright with a gait that was somehow both human and not. Jed had frozen, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, his breath caught in his chest. He watched until the pack and the girl disappeared into the darkening forest. And even then he sat motionless, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. A wild child, a feral human. The stories existed in frontier history, children lost or abandoned, raised by animals becoming something in between. But they were always stories, legends, cautionary tales, not real, not here, not now. That night he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, and Rufus pressed against his leg, listening to the wolves howl their ancient songs in the darkness beyond his walls. The sound was closer than it had ever been, almost surrounding the cabin. And within it, Jed thought he could hear something else. A voice high and wild that might have been human once but had forgotten how to be. When dawn finally came, gray and cold with the promise of the first real snow, Jed stepped outside to find tracks everywhere. Wolf prints circled the cabin, the corral, the woodpile, and among them those other prints. Small, bare human feet that had walked right up to his door, paused there, then retreated back into the wild. He spent that day in a fog of disbelief and wonder. Part of him wanted to dismiss what he'd seen, to chalk it up to failing light and an old man's imagination. But the tracks were real. The evidence was undeniable. Somewhere up in these mountains, a girl lived with wolves, had been raised by them. If the stories Horace had hinted at were true, and for some reason, she had come to investigate him, the newest intruder in her territory, Jed found himself thinking about Sarah, about what she would have said. She had always had a soft heart for strays, bringing home injured birds, feeding the neighborhood cats, volunteering at the children's home in town. Everything deserves a chance, Jed, she would say. Everything deserves someone to see it, really see it, and care. He could almost hear her voice now, could almost feel her hand on his shoulder, urging him toward something he didn't quite understand yet. That evening, as the light began to fail again, Jed did something that surprised even himself. He took a tin plate from the cabin, loaded it with salt pork, biscuits, and some dried apples, and set it on a flat rock about 30 yards from the cabin door. Then he retreated inside, leaving the door cracked open, and waited. The wolves came as full dark settled. He could hear them before he saw them, the soft padding of feet, the occasional huff of breath, the click of claws on stone. Rufus tensed beside him but didn't bark, sensing perhaps that this moment required silence. Through the crack in the door, Jed watched as the pack approached the offering. They circled it, sniffed it, but didn't touch it. And then she appeared. The girl moved into the small circle of moonlight with a caution that was purely animal. She dropped to all fours, approaching the plate with her head low, testing the air. Then, with a quick movement that startled him, she snatched a piece of meat and retreated several steps, watching the cabin with eyes that caught the light and threw it back. Wolf eyes almost in a human face. She ate quickly, efficiently, then took the rest of the food and disappeared into the darkness. The wolves followed, melting into the forest like smoke. And Jed was left standing in his doorway, his heart pounding, his mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. Who was she? How had she come to be here? How long had she lived this way? And most troubling of all, what was he supposed to do about it? He didn't have answers that night or the next or the next. But something had shifted. The cabin no longer felt like a place to hide from the world, to wait out his remaining years in quiet grief. Suddenly, impossibly, it felt like the edge of a mystery that needed solving, a life that needed understanding, maybe even saving. And for the first time since Sarah had died, Jed felt something stir in his chest that wasn't just pain or regret. It was curiosity, purpose, the faint, fragile beginning of something that might, if he was careful, grow into hope. The pattern continued for 5 nights. Jed would set out food at dusk, always in the same spot, always a mix of whatever he had on hand. The girl would come with her pack, always cautious, always quick. She would take what she wanted and vanish back into the darkness. Jed never tried to approach, never made a sound. He simply watched and waited, learning her rhythms, her habits, the way she moved through the world. On the 6th night, everything changed. Jed had just placed the evening's offering, venison from a deer he had brought down that morning, along with some pan bread, still warm from the fire, when he heard something that froze his blood. Not the usual wolf howls, but something else, gunfire. 3 sharp cracks echoing from down the mountain, maybe 2 miles distant, followed by men's voices raised in excitement. Rufus started barking, a frantic sound that spoke of danger sensed but not understood. Jed grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, scanning the treeline. The voices were getting closer, crashing through the underbrush with none of the quiet grace of the wolves. Then he heard it. A yelp of pain, distinctly canine, followed by more shots. They were hunting the pack. The girl appeared at the edge of the clearing without warning, moving faster than Jed had ever seen her move. But this time she wasn't alone. She was dragging something. A wolf, one of the younger ones from the pack, blood matting its fur along its left haunch. The animal whimpered and struggled weakly, clearly in pain but still alive. Behind her, 3 men burst from the trees. They were rough-looking types, dressed in worn canvas and leather, carrying rifles, and bearing the cocksure attitude of men who believed the wilderness belonged to them by right of firepower. The one in front, a barrel-chested man with a black beard shot through with gray, pulled up short when he saw Jed standing on the porch. "Evening," the man called out, his tone friendly enough but his eyes hard. "Name's Cutter. We're tracking a wolf pack that's been taking sheep from the valley. That girl there?" He gestured with his rifle toward where the girl crouched protectively over the wounded wolf. "She's been living rough up here. We'll take her back down to town where she belongs along with that wolf." Jed felt something tight and hot coil in his chest. The girl was staring at him now, her eyes wide and wild with fear and something else. A desperate, pleading look that seemed to say she understood exactly what these men represented. Death, captivity, the end of the only life she knew. "The girl stays here," Jed heard himself say. His voice was calm, measured, but his hands tightened on his rifle. "And the wolf too. This is my land, and they're under my protection." Cutter's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, old-timer, I don't think you understand the situation. That pack has killed sheep down in the valley. There's a bounty on them. And that girl, she's been lost for years. There's folks in Thornwood who've been looking for her. She's not property," Jed said quietly. "She's a human being, and she's not going anywhere." The 2 men flanking Cutter shifted their stances, their hands moving to their rifles. Jed recognized the signs. This was about to turn violent. "You're making a mistake, old man," Cutter said, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "We're 3-1. Stand aside." Jed raised his rifle an inch, not quite aiming, but making his intention clear. "First man who moves toward that girl or that wolf gets a bullet." The standoff held for a long moment, tension crackling in the air. Rufus was still barking. The wounded wolf whimpered. And the girl? She just watched Jed with those strange, wild eyes, as if trying to understand why this old man would risk his life for her. Then, from the forest behind the 3 hunters, came a sound that changed everything. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The rest of the pack emerged from the trees, 6 adult wolves spreading out in a loose semicircle behind the men. The hunters were now caught between Jed's rifle and a pack of wolves protecting their own. Cutter's face went pale. He glanced back at the wolves, then at Jed. "This ain't over," he finally spat. "We'll be back with more men." He gestured to his companions, and they began backing away slowly, keeping their rifles ready. The pack watched them go until the men had disappeared into the forest. Only when silence returned did the pack relax. They padded forward, surrounding the girl and the injured wolf, nuzzling and whining. The girl stroked the wounded animal's head, making soft sounds that weren't quite words, but seemed to comfort the creature. Jed lowered his rifle slowly, his heart still hammering. What had he just done? He had threatened 3 armed men over a feral girl and a wild animal. He had made enemies of people who clearly had resources and determination. But when the girl looked up at him again, something in her expression had changed. The wariness was still there, but beneath it was something new, recognition, or the first fragile seed of trust. She stood slowly, leaving the injured wolf to the ministrations of the pack. She took one step toward Jed, then another, her movements careful and deliberate. Rufus had stopped barking and was watching with intense interest. When she was about 10 feet away, the girl stopped. She looked at Jed, really looked at him, her head tilting. Then she did something that nearly broke his heart. She reached out one hand, palm up, in a gesture that was unmistakably human. A gesture of peace, of thanks. Jed felt his throat tighten. He lowered his rifle completely, leaning it against the porch rail. Then, moving as carefully as he would approach a spooked horse, he stepped down from the porch and extended his own hand. They stood there for a long moment, 2 hands reaching across the space between wild and tame. Jed didn't try to touch her. That would have been too much. But the gesture itself was enough. The wounded wolf whimpered again, breaking the moment. The girl turned back to her pack, dropping to her knees beside the injured animal. She looked back at Jed once more, and in her eyes he saw a question, a plea. "Bring him here," Jed said softly, gesturing toward the cabin. "I can help." He didn't know if she understood his words, but she seemed to understand his meaning. She made a sound, a low, complex vocalization, and the pack responded. 2 of the larger wolves carefully lifted the injured one between them, supporting him as they moved toward the cabin. Jed opened the cabin door wide, and for the first time in its long history, wolves entered. They moved cautiously, sniffing everything. Rufus retreated to the corner, uncertain but not aggressive. Jed quickly cleared space near the fire and spread out an old blanket. The wolves lowered their injured companion onto it, then stepped back. The girl knelt beside the wounded animal, her hand never leaving its fur. "Let me see," Jed said gently, kneeling beside them. The girl tensed but didn't move away. Carefully, speaking in low, soothing tones, Jed examined the wound. The bullet had grazed the wolf's haunch, tearing through muscle but missing bone. Painful but not fatal if he could prevent infection. He fetched his medical kit, an old army surplus box that had seen him through countless injuries over the years. As he worked, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made the wolf yelp, then binding it with strips of clean cloth, the girl watched his every move with absolute attention. She was learning, he realized. When he finished, Jed sat back. The wounded wolf's breathing had steadied. The rest of the pack had settled around the fire. And the girl, she was looking at Jed with something that might have been wonder. "You're safe here?" Jed told her, not knowing if she understood but needing to say it anyway. "Those men won't get you. Not while I'm breathing." She tilted her head, processing. Then slowly, she reached out and touched his hand. Just a brief contact, her fingers rough against his weathered skin, but it was deliberate. A thank you in the only language she had. And in that moment, sitting on the floor of a mountain cabin with a pack of wolves and a wild girl, Jed felt something shift deep inside him. The grief that had weighed him down for 3 years. Suddenly, the weight on Jed's shoulders felt lighter, less like an anchor dragging him down. Sarah's death had carved a gaping hole in his soul, a void he thought could never be filled. But perhaps this strange, unexpected purpose, this responsibility for the girl and her pack, could begin to fill that emptiness. He'd retreated to these mountains seeking oblivion, a place to vanish from the world. Instead, he'd stumbled upon something extraordinary, something that desperately needed his help. And for the first time since he'd stood numbly by, watching them lower Sarah's coffin into the unforgiving, frozen earth, Jed felt a flicker of hope, a reason, however fragile, to look forward to the dawn. Outside, the wind howled with renewed ferocity, whipping through the trees and carrying the first delicate flakes of snow on its icy breath. Winter was arriving ahead of schedule, an early harbinger of the challenges that lay ahead, challenges he couldn't yet fully comprehend. Cutter and his ruthless men would undoubtedly return, their thirst for vengeance unslaked. The girl's mysterious past would eventually catch up to them, casting a long shadow over their fragile sanctuary. But tonight, for this one precious night, none of that mattered. Tonight, a wounded wolf, his life hanging in the balance, was slowly healing by his fire, finding solace in the warmth. A wild girl, a creature of instinct and untamed spirit, had chosen to place her trust in him. A grizzled, solitary old man, and a lonely heart, weary from years of grief, had remembered what it felt like to matter, to be needed, to have a purpose beyond mere existence. The girl and her pack remained huddled near the cabin throughout the night. Jed had half expected them to vanish back into the wilderness once the wounded wolf was stabilized, retreating to their hidden dens and secret trails. But as the hours ticked by, and the fire gradually dwindled to glowing embers, they stayed put, a silent, watchful presence. The wolves instinctively arranged themselves in a loose protective circle around their injured comrade, their bodies providing warmth and a sense of security against the encroaching cold. The girl, her face peaceful in sleep, curled up beside the wounded animal, one small hand resting gently on his flank, her breathing eventually syncing with the slow, steady rhythm of his. Jed remained vigilant in his chair near the door, his trusty rifle resting across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness, a silent guardian watching over them all. Even Rufus, after initially displaying his usual skepticism and apprehension, had finally succumbed to the comforting atmosphere, overcoming his inherent uncertainty to lie near the fire, close enough to the wolves to be considered part of the group, yet maintaining a respectful distance, a subtle acknowledgement of their wildness. The old man found himself marveling at the extraordinary scene unfolding before him. Wild creatures, typically wary and elusive, sleeping peacefully within the confines of a human dwelling, trusting enough to lower their guard, to surrender to the moment of shared vulnerability. As the first faint rays of dawn began to filter through the small, grimy window, painting the room in hues of gray and pale gold, the girl stirred in her sleep. She opened her eyes, dark brown, almost black in the dim light, and immediately checked on the wounded wolf, her brow furrowed with concern. The animal was still sleeping soundly, his breathing even and steady, the makeshift bandage holding firm. Seemingly satisfied with his condition, she rose to a crouch, her movements silent and fluid, betraying a lifetime spent navigating the wilderness. Jed cleared his throat softly, breaking the stillness. "Morning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, not wanting to startle her. "Your friend there, he's going to be fine. I cleaned his wounds good. He just needs rest now." The girl tilted her head, that characteristic gesture that always made her seem both intensely curious and inherently cautious, as if she were constantly evaluating her surroundings, searching for hidden threats. She didn't respond with words, reinforcing Jed's growing suspicion that she might not be capable of human speech at all. Instead, she made a soft sound, almost a hum, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to acknowledge his words, conveying a sense of understanding and perhaps even gratitude. Slowly, carefully, Jed stood and moved to the fireplace. He stirred the slumbering coals back to life, coaxing the embers into a flickering flame, and then hung his battered coffee pot over the flames, anticipating the comforting warmth and familiar aroma. "You hungry?" he asked, glancing back at the girl. She was watching him with unwavering, intense interest, her eyes following his every move. He opened his rudimentary food stores, revealing the meager provisions he had on hand. He pulled out some strips of dried venison, hard biscuits that had probably been sitting on the shelf for months, and a precious jar of honey, a rare treat he'd been saving for a special occasion. He laid them out on the rough-hewn table, then stepped back, giving her space. The girl approached cautiously, moving on all fours, her movements reminiscent of a wild animal testing the wind. She picked up a piece of venison, sniffed it tentatively, then took a small, hesitant bite. Her eyes widened slightly, betraying a flicker of surprise and perhaps even pleasure. She ate quickly, efficiently, tearing the meat with her teeth, her movements economical and purposeful. But when she reached for the honey, something subtle but significant changed. She dipped her finger into the golden liquid, tasted it, and made a sound that was unmistakably delighted. A soft, breathy laugh that was so human, so filled with pure, unadulterated joy, that it made Jed's chest tighten with emotion. "You like that, do you?" he said, unable to suppress the smile that spread across his weathered face. "Honey, the special. Got that from a beekeeper down in Thornwood last fall. Best honey in the county." Over the next few days, a tentative, unspoken routine began to take shape. The girl and her pack would leave at dawn, disappearing silently into the dense forest for hours, venturing out on their own mysterious missions. Jed, in turn, would tend to his trap lines, cut wood to replenish his dwindling supply, and perform the endless tasks required to maintain the isolated cabin. But every evening, as the light began to fade and the shadows lengthened, they would inevitably return, drawn back to the safety and warmth of the flickering fire. The wounded wolf was healing remarkably well, his resilient spirit defying the odds. By the third day, he was tentatively putting weight on the injured leg, though he still favored it with a noticeable limp. The girl, too, began to linger longer each visit, as if she were slowly becoming more comfortable in his presence. She would often sit on the porch steps while Jed worked nearby, watching him with that same intense, studying gaze, as if she were trying to decipher the mysteries of his world. Sometimes he would talk to her, rambling thoughts about the unpredictable weather, the tedious tasks of his day, and the lingering memories of Sarah, his beloved wife. He didn't expect her to understand the words he spoke, but he found that the simple act of speaking, of sharing his thoughts and memories, seemed to put her at ease, as if his voice was a soothing balm to her untamed spirit. On the fourth day, Jed decided to try something new, a small step towards bridging the gap between their vastly different worlds. He'd been repairing a section of the dilapidated fence when one of the wolves, a large, imposing gray male that seemed to be the undisputed leader of the pack, cautiously approached him. The animal stopped about 15 feet away, regarding Jed with intelligent, piercing yellow eyes that seemed to possess an ancient wisdom. The old man froze, hardly daring to breathe, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, slowly, deliberately, he set down his hammer and extended his hand, palm down, offering a gesture of peace and goodwill. The wolf watched him intently for a long moment, assessing his intentions, then took a tentative step forward, then another, until he was close enough that Jed could feel the heat radiating from his thick, winter coat. The wolf sniffed his hand thoroughly, his wet nose twitching as he processed the unfamiliar scent. Then, to Jed's astonishment, he allowed him to gently touch the top of his head. The fur was coarse and thick beneath his calloused fingers, a testament to the harshness of the wilderness. The wolf tolerated the contact for perhaps 10 seconds, an eternity in the world of wild creatures, before stepping back and trotting away, disappearing back into the trees. Jed released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body trembling slightly from the encounter. The girl had been watching the entire scene unfold from the porch, and when he looked at her, he saw something that might have been approval in her expression. A subtle nod of acknowledgement that warmed him to the core. That evening, emboldened by the morning's interaction, Jed decided it was time to attempt something more ambitious, something that might truly begin to unlock the mysteries of her mind. After the evening meal, which the girl now ate sitting at the table rather than crouched on the floor, a sign of her growing comfort and trust, he fetched a slate and some chalk he'd found among Silas Dutton's forgotten possessions. He sat down across from her at the table and drew a simple shape on the slate. A circle. "This is a circle," he said, tapping the slate with his finger, enunciating each word clearly and carefully. Then he handed her the chalk, his heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The girl took the chalk awkwardly, holding it in her fist like a small child might, her brow furrowed in concentration. She stared at the slate, clearly uncertain, her eyes darting back and forth between the circle he had drawn and the piece of chalk in her hand. Jed gently guided her hand, showing her how to make the circular motion, patiently guiding her movements. On the second attempt, she produced something that approximated a circle, wobbly and imperfect, but undeniably recognizable as the shape he had shown her. When she looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise, there was something new in her gaze, something he hadn't seen before. Wonder, perhaps, or the first stirring of understanding that the world contained more than just survival and instinct, that there were abstract concepts and symbols that could unlock new levels of communication. Over the following days, they continued these simple lessons, their makeshift classroom becoming a sanctuary of shared learning. Jed would draw simple shapes, and she would painstakingly copy them, her determination unwavering. He would point to everyday objects, table, chair, cup, fire, and name them repeatedly, hoping the words would eventually take root in her mind, bridging the gap between his world and hers. Progress was slow, measured in tiny increments, but it was progress nonetheless, a testament to her innate intelligence and her unwavering desire to learn. Even Rufus had become an unexpected ally in this unconventional education. The old dog seemed to understand that something important was happening, and he'd taken to staying close to the girl, offering her silent companionship and unwavering support. Sometimes she would reach out and gently touch his fur, her touch curious and tentative. Rufus would stand patiently, his tail wagging slightly, a subtle indication of his approval and affection. But not everything was peaceful. The fragile tranquility they had found was constantly threatened by the encroaching darkness. On the 7th day since the confrontation with Cutter, Jed rode down to check his farthest trap line, a routine task that now filled him with apprehension. His fears were realized when he discovered that every single trap had been deliberately destroyed. Not just sprung, but methodically smashed, the metal twisted and broken beyond repair, rendering them useless. And carved into a nearby tree, a chilling message: last warning. Jed sat on his horse, staring at the crude carving for a long time, his heart sinking with dread. The threat was clear, unambiguous. Cutter hadn't forgotten, and he wasn't going to let this go. He was determined to have his revenge, no matter the cost. When he returned to the cabin that evening, his face grim and drawn, the girl was waiting on the porch with the pack, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and apprehension. She took one look at his face and seemed to understand that something was terribly wrong. She made a questioning sound, a soft whine that echoed the anxiety of her wolves, their senses attuned to the slightest shift in the atmosphere. "We've got trouble coming," he said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. "Those men, they're not going to stop. They'll come back, and when they do, there'll be more of them." He stopped himself, realizing the futility of his words. What was he doing? He was a 63-year-old man, alone in the wilderness, his only companions a feral girl and a pack of wolves. What chance did they have against a band of ruthless, vengeful men? But then the girl did something that changed his thinking, that rekindled the flickering embers of hope in his heart. She stood up, moved down the porch steps, and placed herself directly in front of him, blocking his path. Then she pointed at him, at herself, at the wolves arranged protectively behind her, and she made a sound that was almost a word, a guttural, determined vocalization that seemed to mean something akin to together. Jed looked at her, at those fierce, wild eyes that reflected a spirit that refused to be broken, and felt something shift deep within his chest. She wasn't helpless. None of them were. They were survivors, all of them, bound together by circumstance and a shared will to live. "Together," he repeated softly, the word resonating with newfound meaning. And though he knew she couldn't fully understand the nuances of the word, he thought perhaps she understood the intent, the unspoken promise of mutual support and unwavering loyalty. That night, as the fire burned low and the wolves slept soundly, Jed sat awake, his mind racing, grappling with the weight of his choices and the inevitable consequences. He had chosen to protect this girl, to shield her from the dangers of the outside world, and that choice had set events in motion that he couldn't stop, a cascade of actions and reactions that were now beyond his control. Cutter would come back. There would be violence, bloodshed, but for the first time in 3 long years, since Sarah had slipped away from him, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief, Jed felt like his life meant something beyond just marking time until death. He had a purpose now, a reason to fight, to survive. It wasn't the future he'd envisioned when he'd first ridden up to this remote cabin, seeking solace and solitude, but it was a future nonetheless, and it was his to protect, his to defend with every fiber of his being. The morning after discovering the chilling warning, Jed woke with a plan forming in his mind, a strategy to confront the impending storm. If Cutter and his men were going to come back, driven by their thirst for revenge, then he needed to be ready, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. That meant gathering essential supplies, gathering crucial information about Cutter's plans and movements, and teaching the girl enough that she could survive, adapt, and perhaps even thrive, if something happened to him. The girl had begun sleeping inside the cabin now, curled up near the fireplace with two of the younger, more docile wolves, finding warmth and comfort in their presence. The rest of the pack, ever vigilant, kept watch outside, their senses constantly scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of danger. This morning, she woke when Jed did, her senses acutely attuned to his movements, even in sleep, as if she were somehow connected to him on a deeper, more primal level. "We're going on a ride today," Jed told her as he made coffee, his voice calm and steady, masking the anxiety that churned within him. "Down the mountain. There's someone I need to talk to, someone who might be able to help us." The girl watched him with those dark, evaluating eyes, her gaze unwavering. She'd been learning fast, absorbing information like a sponge. She now recognized perhaps a dozen words, basic but essential for communication. Fire, water, food, danger, wolf, dog, yes, no. It wasn't much, but it was a solid foundation upon which to build. Jed saddled Copper, one of the mules, his most reliable and sure-footed mount. "This here's Copper," he said, patting the mule's neck affectionately. "She's steady as they come. We're gonna ride down to see a man named Horace Blackwell. He's a good man, and he might know something that can help us." The girl approached Copper cautiously, her movements tentative, reaching out one hand to touch the mule's shoulder, her touch gentle and hesitant. Copper turned her head and snuffled at the girl's hair, her soft breath ruffling the strands, and something like a smile flickered across the girl's face, brief as lightning, but unmistakable. A fleeting glimpse of the humanity that lay hidden beneath her wild exterior. Getting her onto the mule took patience and reassurance. She resisted at first, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of being carried by an animal, her body tense and wary. But Jed talked her through it. His voice soothing and reassuring, showed her how to sit properly in the saddle, how to hold the reins, patiently guiding her movements. Eventually, she settled, though she remained tense, her muscles coiled like a spring, ready to react to any perceived threat. They left Rufus and most of the pack at the cabin, entrusting them with its protection. They took only the gray alpha male, the leader of the pack, who seemed determined to follow the girl, his loyalty unwavering. The wolf ranged ahead and behind as they rode, scouting the trail, his senses alert, a silent guardian protecting them from unseen dangers. The ride down the mountain took 3 long hours, each mile taking them further away from their sanctuary. As they descended, the girl's tension visibly increased, her brow furrowed with worry. She made soft, whining sounds, looking back toward the high country, as if she were being pulled in 2 directions. Jed understood her unease. Every step away from the wilderness, away from the familiar sights, sounds, and smells of her home, was a step into a world that had never shown her kindness, a world that had cast her out and left her to fend for herself. Horace Blackwell's ranch, a sprawling spread of land and weathered buildings, sat in a wide valley where the rugged mountains gave way to rolling grassland, a testament to his hard work and perseverance. Horace himself was in his late 50s, a lean, wiry man with a weathered face etched with the marks of a life lived outdoors. His eyes, sharp and observant, missed nothing, constantly scanning his surroundings. He came out of the barn as they approached, a rifle in his hand, but held casually, not in a threatening manner. "Jed Crane," he called out, his voice strong and clear. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Then his eyes fell on the girl, and his expression changed, shifting from friendly curiosity to surprise, recognition, and something else he couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or perhaps a dawning realization. "Lord above, that's her, isn't it? The wild girl, the one everyone's talking about." Jed dismounted slowly, deliberately, his movements measured. He needed to choose his words carefully, to tread lightly. "She's under my protection now, Horace," he said firmly. "And we've got a problem, a serious problem that concerns you too." Over steaming cups of strong, black coffee in Horace's cozy kitchen, Jed laid out the events of the past few weeks, explaining the situation as clearly and concisely as possible. The girl refused to come inside, instinctively wary of enclosed spaces, staying on the porch with her loyal wolf, a silent sentinel guarding their fragile peace. Jed recounted the initial confrontation with Cutter, the deliberate destruction of his trap lines, and the chilling warning carved into the tree. Horace listened intently, his brow furrowing with each revelation, his expression darkening with concern. "Cutter's bad news, Jed," he said grimly. "He and his boys have been causing trouble in Thornwood for years, preying on the weak and vulnerable. The law turns a blind eye because Cutter's cousin is the deputy sheriff, so there's no help to be had from that quarter." "So no help from that quarter," Jed said, echoing Horace's words with a sigh of resignation. Horace refilled their cups, the clinking of the porcelain breaking the heavy silence. "But I can tell you this," he said, his voice dropping lower, his eyes filled with a sense of foreboding. "Cutter's been actively recruiting men in town, spreading lies and fear. Says there's a wild girl up in the mountains that needs catching, that she's dangerous and poses a threat to the community. He's offering shares of bounty money to anyone willing to join his posse." Jed felt a chill settle in his stomach, a cold dread that tightened his muscles and made it difficult to breathe. How many men? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Last I heard, maybe 6 or 7 have signed on, eager to make a quick buck. They're planning to come up after the first heavy snow, figuring you'll be easier to track then, your movements betrayed by your footprints in the snow. The first snow. That could be any day now, Jed realized with a sinking heart. He had a week at most, maybe 2 if they were incredibly lucky. There's something else, Jed, Horace said, his voice dropping even lower, his expression grave. Talk in town. Whispers and rumors that are hard to ignore. Is that the girl? They say she's not just any lost child, a runaway or an orphan. Word is she's the daughter of a missionary couple that went missing 15 years ago, vanished without a trace. Jed's eyes widened with surprise. Missionaries? They were traveling through these mountains, spreading the word, when they disappeared. Search parties found their wagon burned to the ground. Nothing but ashes and twisted metal. No bodies were ever recovered. But if that girl is who I think she is, she'd have family back east, wealthy family. People looking for her, people with rights to her, people who will stop at nothing to get her back. People with rights to her, Jed finished, his voice laced with bitterness. Legal rights, Jed, Horace corrected, his gaze unwavering. The missionaries had family back east, wealthy, influential family. They've never given up hope of finding her. Jed understood the implications. The girl wasn't just running from bounty hunters, from men driven by greed and vengeance. She was potentially the missing heir to a wealthy family, a family that might not care about what she'd become, about the life she had built in the wilderness. They might only care about blood and legacy, about preserving their family name and reclaiming what they saw as rightfully theirs. When Jed emerged from the house, his mind reeling from the revelations he'd just heard, he found the girl sitting on the porch steps, the gray wolf beside her, its presence a silent reassurance. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw a flicker of worry, a reflection of the anxiety that churned within him. She'd heard their voices through the thin walls of the house, even if she hadn't understood the words. Jed sat down beside her, close but not touching, respecting the invisible boundary she had erected around herself. For a long moment, they just sat there in silence, looking out at the valley spread below them, the rolling grasslands stretching towards the horizon. Finally, Jed spoke, his voice soft and gentle. I want to teach you something, he said, his eyes filled with determination. He pulled out a small leather pouch from his pocket and opened it to reveal a handful of coins, silver dollars and smaller denominations. These are called money, he explained. Humans use them to trade, to get things they need, food, supplies, shelter. The girl picked up a silver dollar, turning it over in her hands, her brow furrowed in concentration, studying the embossed eagle, tracing its outline with her finger. But up here, Jed continued, pointing back toward the rugged mountains, you don't need money. You need to know how to read the land, how to find food and shelter, how to track animals, how to stay hidden, how to survive in the wilderness. You already know these things, but I need you to know both ways, the wild way and the human way. Because the world's going to come for you one way or another, and you need to be ready, prepared for anything. The ride back up the mountain was quiet, the silence broken only by the clatter of hooves on the rocky trail and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The girl seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant, occasionally touching the silver dollar Jed had let her keep, as if she were trying to understand its significance, to decipher the mysteries of this foreign object. The wolf ranged wider now, more alert, its senses heightened, perhaps sensing the impending danger, the gathering storm that threatened their fragile peace. As they neared the cabin, the rest of the pack emerged from the trees to greet them, their tails wagging tentatively, their eyes filled with concern. The girl slid off the mule and immediately dropped to all fours, moving among her wolves, touching them, nuzzling them, making soft, guttural sounds that seemed to reassure them. She was telling them something, Jed realized with a surge of understanding, telling them about the danger that was coming, preparing them for what lay ahead. That night, Jed began preparations in earnest, his movements driven by a sense of urgency. He cleaned and oiled both his rifles, ensuring they were in perfect working order. He checked his ammunition stores, counting out each bullet, calculating his options, knowing he had enough for a sustained fight, but not a long one. He reinforced the cabin door and shutters, strengthening their defenses against the inevitable attack. And he began teaching the girl in earnest, not just words now but concepts essential for survival. Danger, hide, run, fight, stay, come. She learned with frightening speed, her mind sharp and adaptable, her thirst for knowledge insatiable. Within 3 days, she could follow simple commands, understand basic warnings, and react appropriately to different situations. She even started making sounds that were almost words, rough, guttural approximations of human speech, demonstrating her determination to bridge the gap between her wild existence and the world of humans. But the most remarkable change was in her relationship with the wolves. When he demonstrated defensive positions around the cabin, explaining the importance of strategic placement, she turned and made a series of sounds to the pack, a complex series of barks, growls, and whines that conveyed his instructions with remarkable clarity. The wolves responded instantly, moving to the positions he'd indicated, learning the terrain, understanding their roles in the defense. She was preparing them, too, Jed realized, preparing them for war, transforming them into a cohesive fighting force. On the 10th day since the warning, the first snow fell, blanketing the landscape in a pristine layer of white. Not a light dusting, but a serious snowfall, heavy and persistent, that laid down 4 inches by morning, transforming the high country into a winter wonderland. The girl stood on the porch watching it fall, her expression unreadable, her eyes filled with a mixture of fascination and foreboding. Jed wondered if she understood what the snow meant, what it represented. That time was running out, that Cutter would come soon, driven by his thirst for revenge and the promise of a bounty. Soon, he said quietly, his voice filled with a sense of inevitability. They'll come soon. The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with an understanding that transcended words. Then she reached out and took his hand, just for a moment. Her touch brief but firm, a silent expression of gratitude and solidarity. Then she released it and whistled, a sharp, clear sound that echoed through the crisp air, summoning the pack. Together, girl and wolves disappeared into the falling snow, their forms blending seamlessly with the winter landscape, becoming one with the wilderness. Jed returned to his preparations, his mind heavy with apprehension. Everything he'd built here, the fragile trust he had cultivated, the small progress he had witnessed, all of it was about to be tested, perhaps destroyed by the coming storm. He wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake, if he should have just run, left the girl to fend for herself. But then he remembered Sarah's words, her unwavering belief in the inherent goodness of all living things. Everything deserves a chance, Jed, she used to say. Everything deserves someone to see it and care for it. He'd made his choice. He'd chosen to protect this girl, and now he would live with the consequences, whether it meant life or death. Either way, he wouldn't be alone. He had found a purpose again, a reason to fight. The snow continued for 3 days, transforming the high country into a pristine white wilderness that was both breathtakingly beautiful and treacherously dangerous. Jed watched it accumulate with growing dread, his hopes dwindling with each passing hour. Every inch that fell was another advantage for Cutter, making their movements easier to track, their escape more difficult. Tracks would be impossible to hide, movements easy to follow. But the girl seemed to thrive in the snow, her connection to the wilderness deepening with each snowflake. She moved through it with an ease that defied logic, her bare feet somehow impervious to the biting cold. She taught the wolves new patterns, new routes through the drifts, creating escape paths and fallback positions, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. On the 4th morning, the sky cleared to a brilliant blue, the sun reflecting off the snow-covered landscape with blinding intensity. Jed stood on the porch, scanning the horizon, when he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Smoke. A thin column of gray smoke rising from the forest about 2 miles down the mountain. A silent signal that shattered the illusion of peace. Someone had made camp within striking distance, their presence a violation of their sanctuary. They're here, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, the words hanging in the crisp air. The girl appeared in the doorway moments later, the gray alpha beside her, their senses attuned to his words. She followed his gaze to the smoke, and her whole body went rigid, her muscles coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action. Jed turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. Those men, they're dangerous, he said, his voice firm. They have guns and they know how to use them. If they get too close, you run. You and the pack, you run deep into the high country. You understand? The girl's face hardened, her eyes blazing with defiance. She made a sound, a low, guttural vocalization that meant a resolute no. Then she pointed at him, at herself, at the cabin, a silent declaration of solidarity. Together. All right, then, Jed said, his voice filled with a mixture of resignation and admiration. But we do this smart. No heroes, no unnecessary risks. We use our heads and we stick together. Over the next hours, Jed worked methodically, positioning supplies at strategic points around the cabin. Ammunition, water, medical supplies, everything they would need to withstand a siege. The girl, in turn, directed the wolves to positions in the surrounding forest, creating a perimeter that would give them advanced warning of any approaching threat. She'd also begun doing something that fascinated Jed, something that revealed a depth of intelligence and strategic thinking he hadn't fully appreciated. Using a sharp stick, she'd drawn in the snow near the cabin, not random marks, but a crude map of their surroundings. The cabin in the center, the creek to the east, the game trail to the south, and marks that represented the wolves positioned like sentries, guarding their territory. You're smarter than anyone gives you credit for, Jed said, studying her map with a sense of awe. That afternoon, one of the younger wolves came racing back to the cabin, whining urgently, its tail tucked between its legs, its eyes filled with fear. The girl immediately went tense, her senses on high alert, making a series of sounds to the pack, summoning them to her side. Within seconds, all the wolves had melted into the forest, disappearing silently into the trees, their presence invisible to the untrained eye. Only the alpha remained, pressed low near the cabin, a silent protector. Jed grabbed his rifle and took position at the window, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he saw movement, fleeting glimpses of dark shapes moving through the trees. 3 men, maybe 400 yards out, working their way cautiously up through the trees. They were being cautious, using cover, but they'd made a critical mistake, a tactical error that betrayed their inexperience. They were following the most obvious path, the easiest route to the cabin, and the girl had predicted exactly that. Jed watched as the lead man stepped forward, his confidence growing with each step, and suddenly plunged through what looked like solid snow, disappearing into a pit the girl had dug and carefully covered 2 days ago, camouflaging it with snow and branches. The man's shout of surprise and pain echoed through the clear air, shattering the silence. His companions rushed forward, their reactions impulsive and predictable, and that's when the wolves struck. Not attacking, the girl had been clear about that. No unnecessary bloodshed, just harassing and frightening, disrupting their advance and sowing chaos. The pack burst from cover on 3 sides, snarling and snapping, but staying just out of reach, their movements coordinated and precise. The men fired wildly, their bullets hitting nothing but trees and snow. One man went down, slipping on a patch of ice in his panic, his rifle flying from his hands, rendering him defenseless. The wolves pressed their advantage, circling, creating the illusion of being surrounded by dozens of animals, their growls and snarls amplified by the surrounding forest. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, the wolves vanished, melting back into the trees, leaving the men in disarray, one still trapped in the pit, one weaponless, all of them shaken and disoriented. After a heated discussion, their voices laced with anger and frustration, they retreated back down the mountain, their initial confidence replaced by a growing sense of unease. Jed released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body trembling with adrenaline. The girl appeared beside him at the window, her eyes gleaming with a fierce and satisfied expression, a quiet triumph in her gaze. "That'll make them cautious," Jed said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Which buys us time, but it'll also make them angry. They won't underestimate us again." That night, they didn't light a fire, depriving themselves of warmth and comfort in order to avoid betraying their position. The girl and her wolves huddled together for warmth, their bodies pressed close for mutual support, and after some hesitation, Jed joined them, seeking solace in their shared presence. It was strange, lying there on the hard floor, surrounded by wild animals, their scent filling the air, but it was also oddly comforting, a sense of connection that transcended words. In the darkness, the girl reached out and found his hand, her small, calloused fingers closing around his rough, weathered ones. She held it for a long moment, her touch a silent expression of gratitude and trust, her way of saying, "Thank you." The next day brought a change in tactics, a shift from direct assault to psychological warfare. Instead of a direct approach, Cutter's men tried to draw them out, to lure them into a trap. They positioned themselves in the forest and fired occasional shots toward the cabin, not trying to hit anything, just making noise, creating pressure, hoping to break their resolve. Jed ignored it, refusing to take the bait. He kept the girl inside, kept her busy with lessons, distracting her from the danger outside. He'd progressed to teaching her letters now, the building blocks of language. A, B, C. She learned them quickly, her finger tracing the shapes in the air, her mouth forming sounds that were slowly becoming words. On the 3rd day of the siege, the shots stopped, the harassment ceased. The forest went eerily quiet, the silence more unnerving than the constant gunfire had been. Jed watched from the window, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. They'd vanished. Then Rufus started growling, a low, continuous rumble that vibrated in his chest. The old dog was staring at the back wall of the cabin, his hackles raised, his eyes fixed on something Jed couldn't see. And then Jed suddenly understood. They were trying to come through the roof, attempting to bypass their defenses by attacking from above. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the center of the cabin, aiming upward, his senses on high alert. Sure enough, he heard scraping sounds, the creak of weight on the old shakes of the roof, the telltale sounds of someone trying to pull apart the decaying structure. They were trying to create an opening to break through the barrier. The girl heard it too, her senses even more acute than his. She made a sharp sound, a high-pitched whistle that echoed through the cabin, and suddenly the wolves were on the roof, appearing as if from nowhere, snarling and snapping, their teeth bared. Men shouted in alarm, their voices filled with panic. There was a scuffle, the sound of bodies sliding on the snow-covered shakes, a scream that cut off abruptly, then silence again. The wolves had caught them by surprise, disrupting their plan. Minutes passed, stretching into an eternity. Finally, Jed heard voices retreating through the forest, carrying someone who was moaning in pain, their progress slow and labored. The wolves had driven them off again, but this time there'd been. She pointed a slender finger at him. Then, her gaze softening, she indicated herself, a silent question etched on her face. A knot formed in Jed's throat. She was asking for a name. Her name. Something more than just the girl. He paused, searching his memory, recalling a conversation long past with Sarah. Whispers of baby names they'd never had the chance to use. "Luna," he breathed, the name feeling foreign yet right on his tongue. "Your name is Luna. It means moon. Like the moon that's been your guide, watching over you all these years." Luna repeated the word, testing its shape with her mouth. "Luna." Then, she mirrored the gesture, pointing at him. Jed. A genuine smile bloomed on her face, the first truly unguarded expression he'd witnessed since their paths had crossed. In that fragile moment, despite the looming danger and the promise of violence, a flicker of hope ignited within Jed. This girl, lost to the wild, was finding her way back to the realm of humanity. And perhaps, he admitted to himself, he was finding his way back too. The act of naming shifted the dynamic between them. Luna became more present, more receptive to the human world Jed was attempting to introduce her to. She repeated words constantly, experimenting with their sounds and meanings. Water, fire, snow, wolf, home. Each utterance was a small victory, a reclaimed piece of her lost humanity. But Jed knew their sanctuary was fleeting. 2 days had passed since the attack on the roof. 2 days of unsettling silence emanating from the forest below. Cutter was regrouping, strategizing. The quiet was thick with unspoken threats. On the morning of the third day, Jed reached a decision. He couldn't passively await the inevitable assault. He needed to understand the nature of the force arrayed against them. "I'm going to scout their camp," he declared to Luna, gesturing towards the base of the mountain. "You stay here, keep the pack close. If I'm not back by sunset, take the wolves and head deep into the high country." Luna's face clouded over. She seized his arm, shaking her head vehemently. "No," she protested, her voice raw. "Jed, no," he echoed gently, prying her fingers loose. "I have to. We need to know what we're facing." Taking only his rifle and knife, he moved into the forest, his movements honed by years of experience. The snow had developed a hard crust, facilitating quieter travel. He descended the mountain, utilizing every natural element as cover, pausing frequently to listen for any sign of the enemy. Cutter's camp was more substantial than Jed had anticipated. 8, maybe 9 men were gathered around 2 roaring fires. They had established a proper base, complete with tents, provisions, and a makeshift corral. These men were equipped for a prolonged siege. Jed found a concealed position behind a fallen log and observed the scene. The men were organized, disciplined. Cutter moved among them, issuing commands that were met with military precision. Then, Jed spotted something that sent a chill through his veins. 3 new men had arrived, leading pack mules laden with equipment. Among the supplies, he recognized long metal tubes, dynamite. The plan became chillingly clear as he listened. They would encircle the cabin, place explosive charges at the foundation, and detonate them simultaneously. The cabin would collapse, either killing or trapping those inside. Clean, efficient, and brutally effective. Jed began to retreat, moving backward with painstaking care. He was perhaps 50 yards from the camp when his boot landed on a concealed branch. The crack echoed like a gunshot in the still air. "There!" someone shouted. Jed plunged into the trees, running as fast as his aging legs would carry him. Behind him, men crashed through the undergrowth. Bullets whizzed past, tearing through branches around him. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed in protest, but he dared not slow his pace. A wolf's howl pierced the air. The gray alpha was somewhere ahead. Then another howl and another. The pack had heard the gunfire and was coming to his aid. They understood the danger. The wolves materialized like spectral gray figures, flowing past Jed towards his pursuers. He heard men shouting, more gunfire, the snarling of wolves. The sounds of pursuit began to recede. Jed didn't stop until he reached the cabin. Luna was waiting on the porch, Rufus beside her, both radiating tension and readiness. When she saw Jed, relief washed over her face. She rushed down, examining him for injuries, making worried sounds. "I'm all right," Jed panted. "But we've got a problem. A big one." Inside, he recounted what he had witnessed. The numbers, the organization, the dynamite. Luna listened intently, her expression growing darker with each detail. When he finished, she remained silent, processing the information. Then, she rose and moved to her snow map. She studied it deep in thought. Finally, she began drawing new marks, new positions. She was adapting their defenses, but Jed knew the truth. No amount of clever positioning could withstand dynamite. They needed a different approach. "What if we don't wait for them to come to us?" Jed said slowly. "What if we hit them first? Tonight, while they think they have the advantage. Take out their supplies, scatter their horses." Luna looked at him, her eyes sharp and calculating. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. She understood. A raid, a reversal of roles. Instead of prey, they would become the predators. They spent the afternoon meticulously planning their counterattack. Jed would infiltrate the camp on foot, using the cover of darkness and stealth. His primary objective was to neutralize the dynamite. Luna and the pack would create diversions, drawing attention away from Jed, then extract him once the mission was accomplished. It was risky, even reckless, but it was preferable to passively waiting in the cabin to be blown apart. As darkness descended, Jed prepared for his mission. He blackened his face with charcoal, donned dark clothing, and meticulously checked his weapons. Luna watched him with palpable anxiety. When he was ready, she approached and placed something in his hand. The silver dollar he had given her. "Luna," he protested, but she closed his fingers around it, holding his hand firmly between hers. "Jed," she said softly, "come back." His throat tightened with emotion. Jed nodded. "I will. Promise." The descent through the darkened forest was treacherous. Jed moved relying on his senses and memory, every nerve on high alert. The wolves ranged ahead, acting as invisible scouts, marking the safest path. As he reached the perimeter of Cutter's camp, he found chaos. Luna had already initiated her diversion. Wolves circled the camp, filling the night with their eerie, spine-chilling howls. The horses were panicking, rearing and whinnying in terror. Men were shouting, firing blindly into the darkness. Jed seized the opportunity presented by the confusion. He slipped through the perimeter and located the supply tent. Inside, he discovered crates marked with warning symbols. The dynamite. He worked swiftly, prying open the crates with his knife. He then seized the sticks of dynamite and scattered them into the forest, throwing them as far as he could in different directions. Without the blasting caps, they were relatively stable, but Cutter's men would face a daunting task in recovering them. He was working on the last crate when a voice from behind him said, "Well, now, looks like the old man's got some fight in him after all." Jed turned slowly. Cutter stood in the tent entrance, his rifle leveled in the firelight. His bearded face was contorted with anger. "That was clever," Cutter said, his voice laced with venom. "But it ends tonight. You're gonna tell me where that girl is?" Jed remained silent. His rifle was out of reach. His pistol was holstered, but Cutter's finger was already on the trigger. Any move would be his last. Then, from the darkness outside, came a sound that froze them both. It wasn't a wolf's howl. It was a human voice, wild and fierce. "Jed." Luna burst into the camp like a force of nature, the gray alpha at her side and the rest of the pack flowing in behind. She moved with a speed and ferocity that was purely animal, yet her eyes were intensely human, focused and determined. Cutter swung his rifle towards her, and Jed acted instinctively. He lunged forward, knocking the barrel aside just as it discharged. The bullet went wide. Then, the tent erupted in chaos. Wolves were everywhere, snarling and snapping, and men were screaming. Jed grabbed his rifle and Luna's arm. "Run!" he shouted. Together, they fled, human, half-wild girl, and pack of wolves, racing into the darkness with gunfire echoing in their wake. They didn't stop until they had put a mile between themselves and the camp. Only then did Jed allow himself to breathe. Luna was beside him, her chest heaving, her eyes shining with triumph. She had saved him. She had ventured into a human camp, faced guns and fire, and she had saved him. "You didn't have to do that," Jed said quietly. "You should have stayed safe." Luna looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw something profound. "Together," she said. The word was clear, resolute. She had made her choice, just as he had made his. They would face this together or not at all. The raid had bought them time, but both Jed and Luna knew it wouldn't be enough. Cutter would be enraged now, humiliated in front of his men. He would return, angrier, meaner, and more determined. The question wasn't if, but when. They spent the next 2 days fortifying the cabin and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Jed taught Luna how to load and fire his spare rifle, her hands awkward at first, but quickly adapting. She was a natural shot, her predator's instincts translating seamlessly to aiming and firing. Within hours, she could hit targets at 50 yards. But on the morning of the third day, something unexpected happened that would alter the course of everything. Jed was outside splitting wood when Rufus began to bark. Not his alarm bark, but something different, almost confused. Jed grabbed his rifle and moved to investigate, Luna following close behind. Together, they approached the edge of the clearing where Rufus stood, tail wagging uncertainly, staring at something in the trees. A woman stepped into view. She was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in practical traveling clothes that had clearly seen hard use. Her face was weathered but kind, framed by dark hair streaked with gray. She held her hands up, demonstrating she was unarmed, but her eyes were fixed on Luna with an intensity that made Jed's skin prickle. "Please," the woman said, her voice trembling. "Please don't shoot. I'm not with Cutter's men. I'm looking for my niece, my sister's child. She was lost in these mountains 15 years ago when she was just a baby. Her name was Elizabeth." Luna had become completely still beside Jed, her rifle lowered, but her body remained tense. She was staring at the woman with an expression Jed had never witnessed before, a mixture of recognition and fear. The woman took a hesitant step forward. "I've been searching for so long. My sister and her husband were missionaries traveling through to the territories. Their wagon was attacked. We found it burned, but no bodies. Everyone assumed they were dead, that Elizabeth was taken or killed. But there were stories over the years. Trappers talking about a wild child in the mountains. A girl who ran with wolves." She paused, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at Luna. "You have your mother's eyes, Elizabeth. My God, you're alive." Jed felt the world tilt on its axis. This was the peace Horace had alluded to. Luna wasn't just a wild girl with no past. She was someone's daughter, someone's niece. She belonged to a family that had mourned her, searched for her. "How did you find us?" Jed asked, his voice tight. "I heard about Cutter's hunt, about a wild girl in the high country, and an old trapper protecting her. I came as fast as I could. I'm Margaret Hayes. Your mother was my sister, Elizabeth. Your aunt." Luna made a sound, a low, confused whine that was purely animal. She looked at Jed, her eyes pleading for him to make sense of this. He could see the internal conflict raging within her, the pull of blood and family against the life she knew, the wilderness that had raised her. "Ma'am," Jed said carefully, "your niece has been living wild for 15 years. She barely speaks. She doesn't remember anything about being human. The wolves raised her." "She's my blood," Margaret interrupted, her voice fierce. "She's all I have left of my sister. I have a home in Boston, money, education waiting for her. She can have a real life, not this existence." Luna suddenly moved, backing away from both of them, shaking her head. "No," she said, the word desperate. "No home here, Jed. Wolf's home." Margaret's face crumpled. "Please, I'm your family. Your mother loved you so much. She sang to you every night. She called you her little moonbeam. That's why I brought this." She reached into her coat slowly and produced something small and worn, a music box. She opened it, and a delicate melody filled the clearing, a sweet and haunting lullaby. And as it played, something extraordinary occurred. Luna's expression transformed. Her eyes went distant, unfocused. Tears began to stream down her face. Tears she didn't seem to comprehend. You remember? Margaret breathed. Somewhere inside, you remember. But Luna was shaking her head, backing away, making sounds of distress that brought the gray alpha rushing to her side. The wolf positioned himself between Luna and Margaret, growling low. The rest of the pack materialized from the forest. Jed understood the predicament. Luna was being torn in two, the human part of her responding to the music, to some buried memory, while the wild part of her screamed that this woman was a threat. This isn't the way, Jed said to Margaret. You can't just expect her to leave everything behind. She needs time. A gunshot shattered the air. The music box exploded in Margaret's hand, pieces scattering across the snow. Margaret screamed, clutching her bleeding hand. Jed spun around, rifle raised, and saw them, Cutter and his men, 6 in total, emerging from the treeline with weapons drawn. Well now, Cutter said, a sinister satisfaction in his voice. Looks like we've got ourselves a family reunion. And lucky for you, Mrs. Hayes, you're just in time to watch us bring your wild niece to justice. Jed's mind raced. They had been distracted by Margaret's arrival, letting their guard down. Cutter must have been tracking her, using her as bait. Now they were surrounded, caught in the open with nowhere to run. There doesn't need to be violence, Margaret said, trying to staunch the bleeding. I'll pay you, Cutter. Whatever bounty you were promised, I'll double it. Just let her go. Cutter laughed. This ain't about money anymore, lady. This is about respect. That old man and his pet savages have made fools of us long enough. We're taking the girl, collecting our bounty, and putting down those wolves. Jed felt Luna press against his side, felt her trembling. The wolves were arrayed around them, sensing the danger, but awaiting her command. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Then Margaret did something unexpected. She stepped forward, placing herself between Cutter's men and Luna. No, she said firmly. I came to find my niece, and I'm not leaving without her. But I'm not letting you hurt her either. That girl is the last piece of my sister I have left. She's family, and family protects family. Nobody moved. Cutter looked genuinely perplexed. Lady, you're either brave or stupid, Cutter said. Either way, you're in the way. Then you'll have to go through me, Margaret said quietly. And I promise you there will be consequences. I have lawyers, resources, connections. You kill me or harm my niece, and you'll hang for it. The law might turn a blind eye to your usual thuggery, but not the murder of a woman from a prominent Boston family. Jed saw the calculation in Cutter's eyes. The man was weighing whether the satisfaction of revenge was worth the legal ramifications Margaret was threatening. The standoff stretched for a long moment. Then Luna did something that changed everything. She stepped forward, past both Jed and Margaret, and stood alone in the space between the two groups. She looked at Cutter and his men, at the rifles aimed at her. Then she looked back at Margaret, at Jed, at her wolves, and she made a choice. She pointed at Cutter and his men. Then she pointed at herself and made a gesture. A clear, unmistakable offer. She was offering herself in exchange for everyone else's safety. She would surrender if they would leave Jed and Margaret and the wolves alone. No, Jed shouted, moving towards her. Luna. No, but she held up a hand, stopping him. Jed, she said, tears in her eyes, but her voice resolute. Family protect family. She had learned that from him. She had learned about sacrifice, about protecting those you love. And now she was using that lesson to save him. Margaret was crying openly. Elizabeth, no, please. But Luna was already walking towards Cutter, her hands raised in surrender. The wolves howled, a sound of loss and grief and fury. But Luna made a sharp gesture, and they stayed back. She wouldn't let them die for her. Cutter grinned, a look of triumph on his face. Now that's more like it. Come on then, girl. As Cutter's men moved forward to seize Luna, Jed felt something shatter inside him. He had failed. He had promised to protect her, and now she was being taken from him. But as Luna passed by Margaret, something extraordinary happened. The wild girl reached out and took the older woman's uninjured hand, squeezing it gently. Then she said something, just 2 words, rough and unpracticed, but clear enough. Aunt Margaret, she remembered. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the wild exterior, a little girl named Elizabeth still existed, and she was reaching out, attempting to bridge the impossible gap between the life she had lived and the life she had lost. Margaret sobbed, clutching Luna's hand. Yes, she breathed. Yes, sweetheart. I'm your Aunt Margaret. Then Cutter's men were pulling Luna away, binding her wrists, leading her towards the forest. The wolves howled. Rufus barked frantically, and Jed stood frozen, watching the girl he had come to love like a daughter disappear into the trees. But even as despair threatened to consume him, something else stirred in his chest. Luna had made her choice to protect them. Now it was his turn. He had let her go once. He wouldn't let her go twice. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment Cutter and his men vanished into the forest with Luna, Jed's paralysis broke. He turned to Margaret, who was still clutching her bleeding hand, tears streaming down her face. How long have they been tracking you? He demanded. I don't know. Maybe since I left Thornwood. I hired a guide, but he disappeared 2 days ago. I thought he just abandoned me. Cutter found him first. He used you, Jed said, his voice hardening. Led you right to us, knowing we'd drop our guard. Damn it. He glanced at the forest where Luna had disappeared. We're going after her now. Margaret looked at him with surprise. I thought you were you barely know her. I know her better than anyone, Jed said quietly. And she's family now. My family. Same as she's yours. He moved towards the cabin. Can you ride? Yes, but my hand. I'll bandage it. We don't have time for anything fancy. Jed was already moving, his mind shifting into a mode he hadn't accessed in decades. The tactical thinking of a younger man who had fought in the Mexican War, who had survived battles and ambushes and desperate situations. That man was still in there, beneath the grief and the years, and he was awakening now. Inside the cabin, Jed worked quickly, cleaning and binding Margaret's wounded hand while outlining the situation. Cutter's got 6 men, maybe 7. They're well armed and they know this country, but they've also got a prisoner to guard and manage, which slows them down. And they don't know about the wolves. The wolves? Margaret repeated. They'll follow her, won't they? Count on it. Jed finished the bandage and began loading supplies into his pack. Ammunition, dried food, water, medical supplies, rope. Everything they might need for a rescue that could unfold in a dozen different ways. The pack won't let her go without a fight, and neither will I. He pulled out a second rifle and handed it to Margaret. You know how to use this? She took it, checked the action with practiced ease. My father taught me. We lived in Montana Territory before we moved east. I'm not helpless, Mr. Crane. Jed, he corrected. And I can see that. He respected her even more for that. She had ventured into the wilderness alone, searching for a niece she had never known was alive, and she had stood up to armed men without flinching. Sarah would have liked her, he thought. Outside, the gray alpha was waiting. The wolf looked at Jed with intelligent eyes, and Jed understood that the pack was ready. They had been tracking Luna since the moment she was captured, staying hidden but close, waiting for the right moment to strike. Can you talk to them? Margaret asked, staring at the wolf with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Not like Luna can, but we understand each other well enough. Jed moved to Copper and began saddling her. They'll lead us to where Cutter's taking her. Then we'll figure out how to get her back. They rode out within the hour, following the gray alpha through the forest. The wolf moved at a steady lope, occasionally stopping to ensure they were following, his nose never far from the ground. The trail Cutter's men had left was easy to follow: broken branches, trampled snow, the occasional drop of blood from Margaret's wounded hand that had dripped before Cutter had bandaged it. But more than that, Jed could read the story in the tracks. Luna was resisting them, not violently, but in a way that made them struggle. She was buying time, he realized, giving him a chance to catch up, trusting that he would follow them. She trusts you, Margaret said quietly after reading the same signs. She barely knows me, but she trusts you completely. I was the first human who didn't try to hurt her, Jed responded. That builds a bond, and maybe, he paused, maybe we both needed each other. I was dying up here, just waiting for my life to end. She gave me a reason to live again, and I gave her, safety, maybe a bridge back to humanity. I'm not trying to take her from that, Margaret said. I need you to understand that. I want her to have choices, to know she has family that loves her, a home if she wants it. But I'm not trying to cage her. I've seen what she is, how she lives. I won't destroy that. Jed nodded. He believed her. He could see in Margaret the same fierce protectiveness that had driven him to stand against Cutter. She'll need both, he said. Both worlds, the wild and the tame. That's who she is now. They tracked through the afternoon, the gray alpha leading them higher into the mountains, not down towards Thornwood. That puzzled Jed at first until he realized what Cutter was doing. The man wasn't taking Luna to Thornwood. He was heading to an old mining camp on the far side of the range, a place that had been abandoned for years, isolated, defensible, far from any law or witnesses. Whatever Cutter was planning, he wanted privacy for it. As the sun began to set, the alpha led them to a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. There, in the gathering darkness, Jed could see the old mining camp, a cluster of dilapidated buildings, a few still standing, most collapsed into rotting timber, and in the center a fire burning, casting dancing shadows. Cutter's camp. Jed pulled out his spyglass and surveyed the scene. 7 men around the fire, passing a bottle, and there, tied to a post outside what looked like an old SA office, was Luna. Even from this distance, he could see that she was unhurt, but her posture spoke of exhaustion and despair. The wolves must have seen her, too, because soft whining sounds began echoing through the pack that had gathered on the ridge. 10 wolves now, maybe even more, were on their way, a full-blown family reunion, albeit an unconventional one. We can't just barge in there, Margaret cautioned, her eyes scanning the crude map Jed had sketched in the dirt. They'll see us coming from a mile away, no matter which direction we approach from. No, we can't, Jed conceded, his mind already racing, formulating plans, dusting off skills he thought had long succumbed to rust. But we don't have to. We just need to create enough distraction, enough chaos that they can't coordinate a proper defense. The wolves can provide that. He turned to the gray alpha, a silent question in his gaze. The wolf met his eyes, an understanding passing between them, deeper than words, a shared purpose, a silent pact forged in the face of adversity. The pack would strike from 3 sides simultaneously, unleashing a maelstrom of teeth and fury, sowing panic and confusion amongst Cutter's men. In the ensuing bedlam, Jed and Margaret would slip in unnoticed, cut Luna free from her bonds, and extract her before Cutter could even begin to mount a coherent response. It was a gamble, a desperate long shot, and men would likely die. Jed knew that, accepted it. He might even be one of them. But Jed had made his peace with death 3 years ago, the day Sarah left this world. He'd been living on borrowed time ever since. Each sunrise a gift he hadn't expected. If this was how it ended, fighting for someone who mattered, for a cause that resonated with every fiber of his being, well, there were certainly worse ways to go. When? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper in the gathering gloom. Full dark, Jed replied, glancing at the darkening sky. Another hour, maybe less. He checked his rifle one last time, the familiar weight comforting in his hands. He ensured his pistol was loaded, the safety off. We go in quiet, stay low to the ground, move fast. The wolves will keep them busy, distracted. We get to Luna, cut her free, and then we run. Don't stop, don't hesitate, don't look back. Just run. The pack will cover our retreat, Margaret added, her eyes glinting with a fierce determination. And if something goes wrong? Jed met her gaze, his own unwavering. Then we improvise, adapt, overcome. But we don't leave without her. No matter what. Margaret nodded, the word a silent vow etched on her lips. No matter what. They waited, the silence punctuated by the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of Cutter's camp. The men below grew louder as the bottle of whiskey made its rounds, their vigilance eroding with each swig. Jed counted it as a small mercy. Drunk men made mistakes, became sloppy in their duties. But they were also unpredictable, prone to fits of violence and reckless behavior. He focused on Luna, barely visible in the fading light. He saw her testing her bonds, working at the ropes with a patience and tenacity that was purely wolf, a primal instinct refusing to surrender. She was trying to free herself, hadn't given up hope. And that, Jed realized, gave him strength, renewed his resolve. As the last sliver of light bled from the sky and the first stars began to prick the darkness, Jed turned to the gray alpha. He pointed at the camp, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the 3 directions of attack he'd identified. The wolf watched him, head tilted inquisitively, processing the information. Then, with a flick of his ears, it turned to the pack and emitted a series of complex sounds, not the mournful howls of the wild, but something more intricate, a language understood only by its own kind. Communication. The pack split into 3 distinct groups, each melting into the shadows, moving with a silent grace that belied their power. They were coordinating, Jed realized with a surge of awe. Luna had taught them tactics, strategy, how to work together in ways wolves didn't normally operate. She'd made them more than just a pack. She'd molded them into an army, a force to be reckoned with. They're ready? Margaret whispered, her voice tight with anticipation, checking the action of her rifle one final time. So are we, Jed replied, his gaze fixed on the camp below. He looked at the woman beside him, a stranger just hours ago, now an ally in a desperate fight. Thank you, he said quietly, the words laden with sincerity. For caring about her, for being willing to fight for her. She's family, Margaret said simply, her eyes shining in the darkness. That's what family does. The gray alpha turned back to Jed, its eyes burning with an ancient fire, waiting for the signal. Jed took a deep breath, forcing his heart to steady, allowing the old combat calm to settle over him. That strange clarity that came before violence, when time seemed to slow and everything sharpened into crystal focus. He raised his hand, held it there for 1 heartbeat, 2, then dropped it, and the night exploded into chaos. The wolves hit from 3 sides at once, their howls ripping through the night, shattering the quiet like breaking glass. Men screamed in alarm, scrambling for weapons, their drunken stupor replaced with sudden, stark terror. The campfire scattered as bodies crashed through it, sending embers flying into the air like angry fireflies. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness with blinding bursts of light. And in the midst of it all, Jed and Margaret moved like ghosts, slipping down the ridge and into the camp, their senses honed, their movements precise. Their entire world had narrowed to a single, all-consuming objective. Get to her, get her free, get her home. The real fight was just beginning. The chaos was absolute. Wolves everywhere, shadows moving with deadly purpose, their snarls and growls creating a primal fear that sent Cutter's men into blind panic. Jed had seen men face combat before. Some held their nerve, their training kicking in. Others broke, succumbing to the overwhelming pressure. These men were breaking, their fear palpable in the air. One of Cutter's men, his eyes wide with terror, fired wildly into the darkness, hitting nothing but air. A wolf darted in, swift and silent, snapping at his legs, driving him backward into another man. They went down in a tangled heap of limbs and curses. Another man was backed against a building, swinging his rifle like a club, desperately trying to fend off 2 wolves that circled him, their eyes gleaming in the firelight. Through it all, Jed and Margaret moved low and fast, using the buildings for cover, their every step deliberate. Jed's heart hammered in his chest, not from fear, but from the singular clarity that came when only the mission mattered. Get to Luna. They were 20 yards from where she was tied, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Then Cutter stepped into their path, his face contorted with fury, his rifle aimed directly at Jed's chest. I should have known, he snarled, his voice laced with venom. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you, old man? Let her go, Cutter, Jed said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This is done. You've lost. Take your men and walk away. Lost? Cutter laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the chaos. That girl's worth $200 to the right buyers. Folks in the territories pay good money for curiosities like her. Put her in a show. Teach her tricks. She'd be a goldmine. The casual cruelty in his voice ignited something hot and dangerous in Jed's chest. A fire that threatened to consume him. Over my dead body, he growled, his hand tightening on his rifle. That can be arranged. The shot came from Jed's left, a deafening crack that momentarily drowned out the surrounding chaos. Margaret had fired before Cutter could react, her aim true. The bullet took Cutter in the shoulder, spinning him around like a top. He went down hard, clutching the wound, a strangled cry escaping his lips. That's for the music box, Margaret said coldly, her voice devoid of emotion. She was already moving past him, toward Luna, her knife glinting in the firelight. Jed followed, covering their backs, his senses on high alert. Margaret reached Luna and began sawing at the ropes with her knife, her movements swift and efficient. Luna held perfectly still, her eyes scanning the chaos, tracking potential threats, her gaze sharp and focused. Behind them, Cutter struggled to his feet, his face a mask of pain and rage. He reached for the pistol at his belt with his good hand. His eyes locked on Jed. Jed turned and their gazes met. Then, a gray shape exploded from the darkness. A blur of fur and teeth, a primal force unleashed. The Alpha launched himself at Cutter with a ferocity that bordered on pure fury. They went down together, rolling through the scattered embers, a tangle of limbs and snarls. Jed, Margaret shouted, her voice urgent. She's free. Luna was up, rubbing her raw wrists, her eyes scanning the scene with lightning speed. She saw the Alpha struggling with Cutter and threw back her head, letting out a howl that was both human and wolf, a sound that carried command and urgency, a call to arms. The pack responded instantly. The Alpha released Cutter and bounded toward Luna, his eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. The other wolves broke off their attacks, racing to converge on their leader, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Within seconds, they were moving as one unit, a unified force flowing toward the edge of the camp, their presence a silent promise of protection. Go! Jed shouted to Margaret, his voice hoarse. Follow them. I'll cover you. Margaret ran after Luna and the wolves, her boots pounding on the uneven ground. Jed stood his ground, rifle raised, scanning the darkness for any remaining threats. Cutter was down, wounded and bleeding. 2 of his men were injured, their moans of pain adding to the cacophony of the night. The others were scattered and disoriented, their bravado replaced with abject fear. They'd come expecting an easy capture, a simple transaction. They hadn't anticipated a war. Jed began backing toward the edge of the camp, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. He was almost clear, the taste of freedom tantalizingly close, when he heard the unmistakable click of a hammer being cocked. Not so fast, old man. A wiry man with a scarred face, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion, had recovered his rifle and was aiming it directly at Jed's chest. His hands were steady, his stance professional. This one was a killer, a man who knew how to take a life. You cost us a lot tonight, the man said calmly, his voice barely audible above the din of the battle. I figure that's worth at least 1 bullet. Jed calculated his chances, his mind racing. His rifle was pointed the wrong direction, useless in the face of this immediate threat. His pistol was holstered, out of reach. He'd never make it in time. This was it. The end he'd been half expecting. The inevitable consequence of a life lived on the edge. At least Luna was safe, free from Cutter's clutches. But before the man could squeeze the trigger, something small and fast crashed into him from the side. A furry missile launched with surprising force. Rufus, loyal, aging Rufus, had his teeth sunk deep into the man's leg, his grip unyielding. The shot went wild, the bullet whining past Jed's ear. A stark reminder of how close he'd come to oblivion. The man screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound, trying to shake off the dog. But Rufus held on with unwavering determination, his teeth tearing at flesh and bone. Jed didn't waste the opening. He swung his rifle around with a speed he didn't know he possessed and fired, the bullet taking the man in the leg, just below the knee. The man collapsed, clutching his leg, his face contorted with agony. Rufus finally released his grip, limping back to Jed's side, his tail wagging tentatively. Good boy, Jed said, his voice rough with emotion, his hand stroking the dog's fur. Good boy, Rufus, let's get out of here. They ran together through the darkness, Jed and Rufus, following the sounds of wolves ahead, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the mining camp was a scene of devastation, a testament to the fury of nature and the resilience of the wild. Scattered fires, wounded men, ruined plans. Jed didn't look back. He found Margaret and Luna waiting in a stand of trees about a quarter-mile from the camp. Luna rushed to him, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce hug, her small body trembling against his. Not from fear, he realized, but from a profound sense of relief. She pulled back and looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. Jed, she said, her voice thick with emotion, her vocabulary expanding daily. Jed, safe. I'm safe. We're all safe, he confirmed, his hand resting on her shoulder, reassuring her. Margaret was reloading her rifle with shaking hands, her face pale but determined. Is it over? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. For tonight, Jed said, his gaze sweeping the surrounding woods. But we need to keep moving. Put as much distance as possible between us and them. Cutter's hurt, his pride wounded. Wounded animals are the most dangerous kind. We need to be long gone before morning. They traveled through the night, pushing hard despite their exhaustion, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the mining camp. The wolves ranged ahead and behind, their senses on high alert, watching for any sign of pursuit. Luna moved between her two worlds with fluid ease, sometimes on two legs beside Jed and Margaret, chattering excitedly, sometimes on all fours, running effortlessly with the pack, her wolfish instincts guiding her. Jed's body was screaming at him, every muscle protesting the relentless pace. His knees ached, his back screamed with each step, and there was a sharp pain in his chest that he tried to ignore, telling himself it was just exertion. He was 63 years old, and he'd just fought a battle that would have challenged men half his age. But he kept moving, driven by adrenaline and a fierce determination to protect Luna. Stopping meant being caught, and he couldn't allow that to happen. Margaret was struggling, too. Her wounded hand had to be throbbing, and he knew she wasn't accustomed to this kind of sustained physical hardship. But she never complained, never asked to rest, never faltered. She just kept moving, her jaw set with a determination that reminded Jed of Sarah. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold, they reached a small box canyon with a narrow entrance, a place that was both defensible and hidden. Jed had discovered it weeks ago while checking his trap lines, a sanctuary he'd almost forgotten. "We'll rest here," he said, his voice hoarse and raspy. "The wolves can watch the entrance. We'll be safe for a few hours." They collapsed inside the canyon, all of them humans and wolves alike, too exhausted to do anything but breathe. Luna immediately went to check on each member of her pack, examining them for injuries, her brow furrowed with concern. Two of the younger wolves had minor wounds from the fight, a few scrapes and cuts, nothing serious, but enough that they needed attention. Jed watched as Luna tended to her family with remarkable gentleness, her movements tender and compassionate. She used techniques he taught her, cleaning wounds with snow, applying pressure to stop the bleeding, combined with the wolf behaviors of licking and nuzzling, offering comfort and reassurance. She was truly both now, he realized with a sense of wonder. Not human trying to be wolf or wolf trying to be human, but something entirely unique, something beautiful. She was a creature of two worlds, belonging wholly to neither, yet possessing the best qualities of both. "She's remarkable," Margaret said softly, sitting beside Jed, her gaze fixed on Luna. "I've been watching her, trying to understand. She's not what I expected. Not damaged or broken, just different. Whole in a way I didn't think was possible." "She's had to be," Jed replied, his voice quiet. "The wilderness doesn't forgive weakness. She survived because she's strong, adaptable, intelligent." Margaret was quiet for a moment, her thoughts swirling within her. "Then what happens now? After we're safe, after Cutter's gone? What happens to her?" Jed had been avoiding that question, pushing it to the back of his mind. He knew it was inevitable, but he dreaded the answer. "That's not my choice to make," he said finally, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "It's hers. But she's still a child," Margaret protested, her voice laced with concern. "She's 16, maybe 17 years old," Jed interrupted gently. "And she's been making her own choices for most of those years. We can offer her options, show her possibilities, provide her with a safe and loving environment. But we can't cage her, Margaret. We can't force her into a life she doesn't want." "I don't want to cage her," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I just want her to know she has a home, a family, that she doesn't have to be alone." "She's not alone," Jed said, gesturing at the wolves who lay sprawled around them, their eyes watching them with unwavering loyalty. "She never was. But I understand what you mean, and I think there's a way for her to have both your world and this one. A balance that allows her to embrace her full potential." Luna finished tending to the wolves and came to sit with them, her movements graceful and fluid. She looked exhausted, her face smudged with dirt and smoke, her clothes torn and tattered, but her eyes were clear and steady, reflecting the strength and resilience that burned within her. She'd been through a crucible tonight, tested to her limits, and had emerged from it stronger, more determined than ever. She looked at Jed, then at Margaret, then reached out and took both their hands, joining them together in her own. It was a deliberate gesture, symbolic, a silent declaration of belonging. She was choosing both of them, both worlds, embracing her complex identity. "Family," she said, the word clear and certain, a testament to her growing vocabulary. Then she pointed at the wolves, her eyes filled with love and affection. "Family," she repeated. She pointed at Jed, her touch gentle and reassuring. "Family." She pointed at Margaret, her gaze filled with gratitude. "Family." Her hand moved to encompass all of them, human and wolf, wild and tame, predator and protector. "All family," she declared, her voice ringing with conviction. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, her heart swelling with emotion. She reached out slowly and touched the girl's face, her fingers tracing the delicate contours of her cheek. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "All family, all of us." For a moment, they sat there in the growing dawn light, 3 humans and a wolf pack, refugees from violence, bound together by choice and something deeper than blood. The morning was cold, the danger not yet past, the future uncertain. But in that moment, there was peace, a sense of belonging that transcended the chaos that had brought them together. Rufus limped over and collapsed against Jed's leg with a satisfied groan. His body weary but content. The old dog had earned his rest, his loyalty unwavering, his heart as wild and free as the wolves that surrounded them. "We should sleep," Jed said, his voice heavy with fatigue. "A few hours at least. The wolves will keep watch," Margaret said, leaning back against the canyon wall and closing her eyes. "Then we'll figure out our next move, decide where we go from here." "What about Cutter?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "He's not going to let this go. He's hurt, his men scattered, his plans in ruins," Jed said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "And with you threatening legal consequences, dragging his name through the mud, I doubt he'll want to stick around and face the music. Cutter knows when to cut his losses." Luna curled up between them, using Margaret's coat as a pillow, her breathing already slowing, her body relaxing into sleep. Within minutes, she was sound asleep, oblivious to the dangers that still lurked in the shadows. The wolves arranged themselves in a protective circle around them, their presence a silent barrier against the outside world. Margaret leaned back against the canyon wall and closed her eyes, her body aching with exhaustion. Jed stayed awake a while longer, keeping watch, his senses on high alert, thinking about everything that had happened, the improbable chain of events that had led them to this moment. 2 months ago, he'd been a broken man, a recluse waiting for death to claim him, his heart heavy with grief. Now, he was part of something larger than himself, a family that transcended all boundaries, a bond forged in the fires of adversity. Sarah would have loved this, he thought, a familiar ache rising in his chest. She would have loved Luna, would have understood what the girl was, what she represented. A symbol of hope, of resilience, of the enduring power of love. I kept my promise, Jed whispered to the morning air, to Sarah's memory. I went and lived, found something worth fighting for, found family again. In the way the soft light touched the canyon walls, in the peaceful breathing of Luna sleeping between him and Margaret, in the warmth of Rufus pressed against his leg, he felt an answer, a sense of rightness, of belonging, of beginning again. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long had finally begun to dissipate, replaced by a glimmer of hope, a flicker of purpose. When Jed finally allowed himself to sleep, his dreams were peaceful for the first time in 3 years. And when he woke, the sun was high in the sky, Luna was sitting with the wolves, laughing and chattering, and Margaret was making coffee over a small fire, the aroma filling the canyon with a comforting scent. It looked like home, felt like family, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Jed felt like he'd found his way back to living, back to the world he thought he'd lost forever. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful night at the mining camp, 3 weeks of healing, of learning, of figuring out what came next, of forging bonds that would last a lifetime. They'd returned to the cabin, Jed, Margaret, Luna, Rufus, and the wolf pack, each of them carrying the scars of their shared experience. The small, unassuming structure that had once been Jed's refuge from grief had become something else entirely, a haven, a sanctuary, a bridge between worlds. The first snow of true winter had fallen the night before, blanketing everything in a pristine layer of white, transforming the familiar landscape into a winter wonderland. Jed stood on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands, watching Luna work with the wolves in the clearing, her laughter echoing through the crisp morning air. She was teaching them something, some new game or training exercise, and the pack followed her lead with absolute trust, their movements fluid and coordinated. Margaret emerged from the cabin, wrapped in one of Jed's old coats, her face flushed from the warmth inside. Her hand had healed well, though she'd carry a scar from where Cutter's bullet had destroyed the music box, a permanent reminder of the night their lives had irrevocably changed. She said she didn't mind it, though, said it reminded her of the night she'd found her niece, the night she discovered a part of herself she never knew existed. "She's going to stay, isn't she?" Margaret said quietly, her gaze fixed on Luna, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and acceptance. "Here in the mountains, part of the time," Jed said, his eyes softening as he watched Luna interact with the wolves. "She's agreed to spend winters down in Thornwood with Horace Blackwell's family, where she can learn to read and write properly, learn more about human ways, socialize with other children. But come spring she'll return here, to the high country, to her wolves." Margaret finished, a smile playing on her lips. "Yes," Jed replied, his heart swelling with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He watched Luna laugh again, a sound that still surprised him every time he heard it, a melody that filled the air with joy. "She needs both, Margaret. The wild keeps her strong, keeps her grounded, keeps her who she is, but she also needs the human world, the opportunity to learn and grow, to connect with others. It's not one or the other anymore. It's both. A beautiful tapestry woven from 2 distinct worlds." Margaret was quiet for a moment, her thoughts coalescing in her mind. "Then I'm going to buy property near Blackwell's ranch," she announced, her voice filled with determination. "Build a house there, a place where she can come whenever she wants, a safe haven where the wolves are welcome, a space that's entirely her own. I can't take her back to Boston, force her into a life she doesn't want. I see that now, but I can bring Boston's resources here, create a life for her that embraces both her wildness and her humanity." Jed smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "Sarah would have liked you, Margaret. She always believed there was more than one way to be family, that love could transcend all boundaries, that even the wildest creatures deserved a chance. I wish I could have met her." Margaret said softly, her eyes filled with a wistful longing. Me too, Jed replied, his chest tightening with a familiar pang of grief. But it was the good kind of ache now, a reminder of the love he'd shared, not a burden of sorrow. But in a way, she's part of all this, isn't she? She taught me that everything deserves a chance, that everything deserves someone to see it and care, that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope. Luna noticed them watching and waved, a wide grin spreading across her face. She said something to the pack, and they immediately settled into resting positions, their eyes fixed on her, their loyalty unwavering. She jogged over to the porch, her bare feet crunching in the snow. Jed, she said, her vocabulary expanding daily, her pronunciation becoming clearer with each passing day. Margaret, come, want show you something. They followed her into the forest, Luna leading the way with sure steps, her bare feet seemingly impervious to the cold. The gray alpha walked beside her, a silent guardian, his presence a constant reassurance. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, the silence broken only by the crunching of snow beneath their feet and the occasional call of a bird. Finally, they reached a small clearing that opened up to reveal a breathtaking view of the entire valley below. In the distance, smoke rose from the town of Thornwood, a reminder of the human world. Behind them, the towering peaks of the mountains where the wolves roamed free, a symbol of the wild. Luna pointed at the valley, her eyes shining with understanding. Human world, she said, her voice clear and strong. Then, she pointed at the peaks, her gesture encompassing the vast wilderness that stretched before them. Wolf world. Finally, she pointed at the clearing where they stood, her gaze sweeping across the snow-covered ground. Luna world, she declared, her voice filled with pride. Both together. It was the most complex thought Jed had heard her express, and it was perfect in its simplicity, a distillation of everything she'd become, a testament to her unique identity. She understood exactly what she was: not human, not wolf, but something new, something different, something extraordinary, something that belonged to both worlds, yet was entirely her own. Yes, Jed said, his voice thick with emotion, his heart swelling with pride. Luna world, both together, a place where you can be yourself, where you can embrace all the things that make you who you are. Margaret knelt down so she was at eye level with Luna, her hand resting gently on her shoulder. Your mother would be so proud of you, she said, her voice filled with love. She loved these mountains. She loved the wild things. She believed in the power of connection. She would have understood what you've become, embraced your wild heart, celebrated your unique spirit. Luna reached into the leather pouch she wore around her neck, a pouch that had been with her since Jed had found her in the wilderness, and pulled out two objects, each holding a profound significance. One was the silver dollar Jed had given her, worn smooth from handling, a tangible representation of her connection to him. The other was a small piece of the music box, a porcelain fragment showing a faded image of a woman's face, her mother's face. The only physical reminder she had of the woman who had given her life. She held them both up, one in each hand, her eyes shining with a deep understanding. Jed family? She said, indicating the coin, her voice filled with love and gratitude. Margaret family, she said, holding up the porcelain fragment, her gaze soft and tender. Luna keep both always, close to heart. Margaret pulled Luna into a hug, her arms wrapping around her niece with fierce protectiveness. And this time, Luna didn't stiffen or pull away, didn't resist the physical contact. She hugged back, her arms wrapping around her aunt with surprising strength and certainty, her body language conveying a sense of trust and belonging. Jed turned away to give them privacy, his own eyes burning with unshed tears, his heart overflowing with a sense of gratitude he couldn't express. He'd come to these mountains to die, to escape the pain that had consumed him. Instead, he'd found life again, found family again, found a purpose that had given his days meaning. The gray alpha approached and pressed his head briefly against Jed's hand, a silent gesture of gratitude and respect, before returning to Luna's side, his presence a constant reassurance. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the cozy cabin, the aroma of simmering stew filling the air, there was a knock at the door. Horace Blackwell stood outside, his hat in his hand, his expression somber. Heard you folks were back, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Wanted to let you know that Cutter and his boys cleared out this morning. Went south, headed for the border. I doubt they'll be bothering anyone in these parts again. The townsfolk made sure of that. Good, Jed said, relief washing over him. Come in, Horace. Have some coffee, warm yourself by the fire. Over coffee and dinner, they finalized the plans for Luna's future, the details carefully considered and agreed upon by everyone involved. Luna would spend winters at the Blackwell Ranch, learning and growing, receiving an education and the socialization she needed, with the full understanding that she could return to the high country whenever she needed to reconnect with her wolves, to embrace her wild heart. The wolves would be welcome on Blackwell's land, free to roam and hunt, their presence a testament to the bond that Luna had forged between two worlds. Margaret would buy her house near the ranch, a place where Luna could always find refuge, a home away from home. She'd set up a trust fund for Luna's education and future, ensuring that she had the resources she needed to thrive, but the money was Luna's to use as she saw fit, not a leash to control her, not a way to dictate her destiny. And Jed would stay in his cabin, working his trap lines, living the life he'd come here to find, the life that had brought him peace. But it wouldn't be a life of solitary grief anymore. A life of empty days and lonely nights. It would be a life of purpose, of family, of knowing that come spring, a wild girl and her wolves would return, and he'd be there waiting, his heart overflowing with love. As evening drew to a close and Horace headed back down the mountain, the snow crunching beneath his boots, Jed stood on the porch one more time, looking up at the stars, the vast expanse of the night sky filled with an infinite number of possibilities. Luna came to stand beside him, her hand slipping into his, the gray alpha on her other side, his presence a silent reassurance. Jed, Luna said eventually, her voice soft and filled with gratitude. Thank you for Luna, for care, for family. Jed's throat was too tight to speak, his heart overflowing with emotion. He just put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close to his side. She leaned into him, her small body warm and comforting. This girl who'd been raised by wolves, who'd learned to be human without losing her wild heart, had given him more than he could ever repay. Thank you, he said finally, his voice husky with emotion, his words heartfelt. Thank you for giving an old man a reason to live again, for bringing joy back into my life, for showing me that love can conquer all, that family can be found in the most unexpected places. They stood there under the stars, surrounded by family, both human and wolf, in a cabin at the edge of the wilderness where two worlds met, a place where anything was possible. Jed thought of Sarah, of the promise he'd made to her, of the long and winding journey that had brought him here. He'd come to these mountains to die, to escape the pain of loss. Instead, he'd learned to live, to love, to embrace the wildness within himself and others. And in teaching a wild girl about humanity, he'd rediscovered his own, found a connection to the world he thought he'd lost forever. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its voice echoing through the silent night. Not a sound of loneliness, not a mournful cry of despair, but a sound of belonging, of connection, of home. A call that resonated with Jed's soul, a reminder that he was no longer alone. And Jed, for the first time in 3 years, felt completely at peace.